Good afternoon. My name is Scott Thomas, and I'm the John P. Jacko Bogan Dean at the University of Wyoming, and I have the honor of chairing AERA's 2022 E.F. Lindquist Award Committee. We are here today to recognize Professor Daniel Koretz of Harvard University as the 2022 recipient of the E.F. Lindquist Award. This is where you applaud. Great group. Named in honor of outstanding scholar and researcher E.F. Lindquist, this annual award is presented jointly by AERA and ACT in recognition of outstanding applied or theoretical research in the field of testing and measurement. There are three distinguishing criteria for this award. First, the award is meant to acknowledge a body of research of empirical, theoretical, or integrative nature rather than a single study. Second, although the research is not required to have led directly to improved educational practices, it should nevertheless be rich in suggestions for additional research that does hold such promise. And third, the award recognizes research that has advanced to the companion goals of 1, greater understanding, and 2, improved use of testing and measurement techniques. I thank the members of the committee for their time and good judgment. Yi Tong he's Senior Vice President of Assessment Operations at the National Board of Medical Examiners. Laura DeSimone, Professor and Director of Research at the University of Delaware. Diane Henderson, Vice President for Research at ACT. And Samuel Herring, Senior Research Scientist at ACT. I also extend our gratitude to Nathan Bell, the Director of Governance and Special Projects at AERA, for the expert support that he provided to the committee. As is custom, the winner of the 2022 award has been invited to give the E.F. Lindquist Award Lecture at this year's annual meeting. This is why we are here today. An article coming from today's lecture will be considered for publication in the Journal of Educational and Behavioral Statistics. Now to our awardee. Daniel M. Koretz is the Henry Lee Shattuck Research Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. His work in 6 areas, let me count them. 1, score inflation. 2, the effects of testing programs on educational practice. 3, the assessment of students with disabilities. 4, the international differences in the variability of student achievement. 5, the application of value-added models to educational achievement. And 6, the development of methods for validating scores under high-stakes conditions have notably advanced measurement and testing practices around the world. Dan is perhaps most widely known for his enduring contributions on test score inflation and self-monitoring assessments. He is a member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. Professor Koretz, it is our honor to recognize you with the E.F. Lindquist Award for 2022, and we're eager to hear your lecture.
Thank you, Scott, for that generous introduction. I'm greatly honored by receiving this award. Actually, it's the wrong adjective. I'm daunted, given the list of people who preceded me. And I'm also delighted that the award is named after Everett Lindquist, because his work actually illustrates the main point I want to make today, which is the need for balance in educational assessment. So I'm going to talk about Lindquist. I'm going to go back a long ways, actually the better part of a century, and eventually, by the end, I hope end up in the present. So what do people know about E.F. Lindquist? The thing that most people would point to is that he was not only a pioneer in achievement testing, but arguably the most prolific test developer in American history. He was also an accomplished applied statistician. Among other things, he published in 1953 an exposition of what we now call generalizability theory, years before Cronbach did. Cronbach acknowledged his work. He was an inventor and an entrepreneur. I'll leave that out to save time, but he was also a skeptic. That may not be quite the right word, but it's the attribute I want to stress. Even though he was an extraordinary test developer and a statistician by training and trade, he spent a good bit of time exploring the limitations, and not just exploring, explaining the limitations of testing and the implications of those limitations for the design of tests, for the use of tests, and for inference, and that's what I want to come back to. So just to give you a flavor, I suggested to, hundreds of graduate students that they read Lindquist's chapter in the 1951 edition of Educational Measurement, which he also edited. I don't think many did because it was the only non-required reading on my syllabus. But one did. I'll actually advance to the end here. Sent me an email the night he read it, and with two bullets. First, why doesn't everyone read this chapter? And second, is there anything left for me to do? I'll come back to that at the very end. So these are some things that he discussed just in that one chapter. The large and unavoidable gap between test content and what he called the ultimate and general goals of education, what we want students to be able to do once they leave school, the primary importance of impact on achievement, goals, habits, and attitudes. I'll show you in a minute why I've bolded the last three. The gap between both curricula and test frameworks and what he called criterion behaviors, again, what you want to see when kids leave school. The dearth of test content that crosses subject matter boundaries, both the advantages and disadvantages of using both simple and complex tasks and assessments, something we're still grappling with, I think not always effectively today, and my favorite, undesirable teaching to the test and score inflation. And so I'm going to give you actually a few quotes to read, and that's one. This is Lindquist on test impact. I'll give you a moment to read. I added the emphasis. So here you have one of the pioneers of achievement testing and arguably the most prolific test developer in our history, warning us that what was most important was the impact of testing programs on everything else other than achievement. How far we've come. How many people even think this way at this point? So I would argue that Lindquist's work represents a balance between two fundamental parts of measurement. I don't have very good terms for these, so bear with me. The first, I'm labeling technique. That was Ed Hartle's suggestion. It was closer than my original. And this is what dominates the field today. It's the mathematical and procedural core of testing, of test construction, of scaling, of linking, of reporting, of performance on tests. It's what people typically think of when they think of psychometrics. The second part I'm mislabeling as practice. This is focusing on the purposes of testing, the limitations of testing, the trade-offs between approaches to testing, and most importantly, the implications of all of this for design, use, and inference. And what makes this categorization not so accurate is a lot of the second category is actually technical work. And what I'll come back to at the end is that one of the responses I think we need to make to reestablish the balance that Lindquist and others have shown is technical work in the area of practice. So actually, let me go back a bit. Lindquist was not alone in this. I think most people in this room can name other eminent scholars in measurement who demonstrated the same balance. Both of my two mentors, H.D. Hoover and Bob Lynn, certainly did. Many of the other people who've received this award did. But despite that, my thesis is that the balance that his work, Lindquist's work, exemplified has withered, especially over the last 20 years. And work in the first category has pushed aside, to a substantial degree, work on the second type of fundamental. And I'm going to argue also that this imbalance has been particularly severe in the case of problems in current measurement practice. And as a result of that, there are big issues big problems that we simply don't adequately address. So I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to limit this to three examples. The first is the mix of papers in journals, and I'm going to focus on only two, Educational Measurement Issues in Practice and the Journal of Educational Measurement. Second, the lack of robustness in performance standards. And third, my favorite, score inflation, which I'm including not just because it was important to me, but because it was important to Lindquist, more important than his 1951 paper suggests. And at the end, I'd like to come back to steps toward reestablishing a better balance. So I can't give you a good review of either journal, but I just decided to pick a couple of papers from 20 years ago from Educational Measurement Issues in Practice. Historically, that journal has been the premier outlet for what I'm calling practice, for practical issues of test use and interpretation. It's where technical people went to publish their work on practice. So I picked a couple of articles, and they are typical. If you go back and pull these issues, you will see I didn't cherry pick. These are typical of what you see. In December of 2001, you have a paper by Bob Brennan, who is certainly known primarily for his technical work, entitled Some Problems, Pitfalls, and Paradoxes in Educational Measurement. A year and a half later, you have H.D. Hoover's 2002 NCME presidential address reprinted as a paper. Some common misconceptions about tests and testing. He described three. First, misconceptions about gender differences. Second, misconceptions about the purposes of norms. And he segued from there into the lack of robustness of performance standards, which I'll come to in a few minutes, and misconceptions about the reliability of tests of very young children. All right, so that was typical of what you saw in EMIP 20 years ago. Look at it now. I had a stack of them on my desk as I was preparing this talk. The journal is bigger than it was once. There's room for a lot more than there was back 20 years ago. But you'll find relatively few articles like this. You'll find some papers, some very good ones. But mostly what you'll find is not this. One of the ones I had on my desk as I was preparing this was a paper with 27 equations. It was a very good paper and very interesting paper that I would have reviewed favorably for most other journals, but why was it there? That says something about what's happened to this journal. So you might say, well, that should have gone in Journal of Educational Measurement, but the Journal of Educational Measurement was not always a purely technical journal. So I'm going back a long ways now to 1978 because I want to reference these three papers in a few minutes. You will find in one issue back in 1978 an argument about the arbitrariness of performance standards written by Gene Glass, Jim Popham, and Ron Hamilton. Gene Glass was critical. Jim Popham and Ron Hamilton were supportive of the use of cut scores. And I will come back to that. But my point now is simply that you could find arguments of that sort in JEM back then. All right, so what about the lack of performance of robustness of performance standards? Here I'd like to give you a little evidence. This will not be new news to all of you. But here again, I want to go back. I want to go back earlier than, well, quite early, because part of my point is that the problems I'm describing are old news. A lot of time has passed since prominent people like Lindquist have pointed these out, and yet we have not solved them. So here's a summary of some of the findings of empirical studies of the robustness of performance standards. The first, which I'm going to show you concretely in a moment, is that results often differ dramatically across methods. The second is that within methods, results often vary markedly as a result of absolutely irrelevant factors: item format, item difficulty, composition of the panel, and more recently, the arbitrary choice of a response probability in the bookmark method. These should all have no bearing, logically, on where the cut score is placed, but they do. The first study that I recall of this, leaving out the bookmark, was the National Academy of Education report on the National Assessment Achievement Levels that Laurie Shepard and others wrote, I believe, in 1992. So this is old news. The last has the wrong adjective. I say results often differ in inexplicable ways, I should say implausible ways, across states and within states across grades, across subjects. So some data. In 1989, Dick Yaker, who was then one of the country's leading experts on performance standards, published a review in that issue of that volume of Educational Measurement that included a 2-page table of 32 contrasts between methods drawn from 12 studies. And one of the things that Dick described was the ratio of the higher percent passing to the lower percent passing, using two methods on the identical sample. And these are the summary statistics. Now, leaving aside the appalling 42, all of them are bad news. Even the best, the median, 1.5, is the superintendent of schools supposed to get up and say, well, we have either 40 or 60% of our students who are proficient. But that's what this implies. So there have not been, I'll come back to this fact in a moment, similar reviews since that time in all these years. But Bob Lynn, 11 years later, published a study of standard setting in Kentucky when Kentucky was about to start a new assessment program. And it's been traditional in Kentucky since the early 1990s to test in a lot of subjects. They test in 5 subjects in elementary grades, splitting it between 4 and 5. So these are the results of standard setting with 3 methods. And really all you need to look at is the line in blue at the bottom, which is the same ratio I gave you for Dick Yeager's review. And you see that in the best case, the ratio between the most lenient and the most stringent was essentially a factor of 2, and in the worst case, a factor of 11. All right? But it goes on. Most of you probably recall, many of you probably recall that, 10 years ago or so, there was a big fuss because it was discovered that a lot of states were using performance standards that were a lot more lenient than those of the national assessment. There are even websites that use the term honesty to refer to this. An honest standard setting is one that is no more lenient than the national assessment. I mean, leaving aside giving that role to the national assessment, I mean, the national assessment, in my view, is a very, very good test, but their performance standards are just performance standards. There's nothing magical about them. But all of the variations between state standards and NAEP were not necessarily states trying to be charitable. Many were, but some weren't. So I received an email maybe 6 or 8 weeks ago from a reporter at Newsweek who wanted me to comment on the abysmal proficiency levels in secondary school mathematics in the Baltimore City schools. There are schools that with 0. And unfortunately, I didn't have time to talk to her, but I sent her a quick note saying, look at the state first. She didn't reply. So here is the state. Now, many of you probably don't know much about Maryland. I lived there for many years. Maryland is what you could call a middling state. It has some very low achieving areas, some very high achieving areas. If you look at their mean scores in national assessment, you'll find that they track the national average pretty well. It's a truly middling state. So here you have the last pre-pandemic year, grade 8. The state test yielded 12.5% proficient in 8th grade math, and the national assessment sample was 33%. So if you didn't know compare the data from other places, you might say, well, maybe the state test is more reasonable. Let's get some normative data, throw in some of the lowest performing states. And what you have is that the state test in Maryland is telling parents that the proportion of kids proficient on the state test in mathematics is half what the national assessment shows for the lowest scoring states in the United States. It makes no sense, whatever. And while this is kind of gilding the lily because estimation at the tails isn't very good, if you look at the percent advanced, it's pretty striking. The state says there ain't none, and the NAEP says 12%. They can't both be right. All right, so let's go back to 1978. Gene Glass wrote that performance standards were arbitrary and capricious. He actually threw in a few more adjectives as well, but capricious is the one that mattered. That was a really bad choice on Gene's part. I'm not saying that because he was necessarily wrong, but because it's a red herring and it distracted people from the real point, which is the arbitrariness. So what we got from his opponents is, yes, they're arbitrary, but no, they're not capricious. I'm not quite sure what that meant. They cited dictionary definitions, but I don't think it matters at all. Capriciousness is not the point. The point is the arbitrariness. What matters is that they're arbitrary, that the variations in results are huge in some cases, and that we can't offer a persuasive reason for picking one over the other. So what should we do? Well, Bob Lynn, in response to what he found in Kentucky, said, don't use them. He said there are times when you need a binary cut. If you're looking at the tests, the many tests that are given to pilot trainees before they get their license, you have to decide, yes, she can fly the plane, or no, she can't. And then you need to set a binary cut score. But when you don't need to, don't. To this day, I don't think I've seen any papers arguing with him about that. People just ignored it. And elsewhere, he and Dick Yeager both said, well, report more than one method. That's not going to happen. The superintendent's not going to say, well, you can have 40% with this method or 60% or 80% with that method. That's not going to happen. There have been a few efforts. Ed Hartle is one example of people who have tried to devise new methods that tie standard setting more closely to meaning, to actual student performance. His briefing book method, those have gained, as far as I can tell, very little traction in the world of practice. And perhaps the most telling thing of all was a phone call I made. I have to admit, I sometimes cheat when I'm failing in a literature review, and just call somebody I know who's in the field and say, what am I missing? Give me something. So I did that because I could not find anything newer than Dick Yeager's 1989 review. And the answer was, oh, there aren't any. And I said, well, how can there not be? This is the fundamental question. Are we uncovering something that's robust enough that we can talk about it? And the person said, well, those of us in the field have really not focused on that much lately. We're mostly focused on procedural things. And I thought that was absolutely damning, because what that person was saying was, we'll just set aside this fundamental question of validity and worry about how we write, when we give the impact data. All right, now to my favorite, score inflation. This is what Lindquist wrote in 1951. I'll let you read it. All right. This was not his first rodeo. This was not the first time he got involved in this issue. Those of you who are Iowa mavens know that there were earlier Iowa testing programs, one of which was named variously the Iowa All Pupils Test and the Iowa Brain Derby. That's what the press called it, which was a test that schools used to compete. And in fact, Lindquist was partly responsible for that competition, not having known at the beginning what was going to happen. But by the mid-1930s, you have to talk to people at Iowa to get all these details, by the way. I don't think they're written down anywhere. But by the mid-1930s, he realized that what was going on in classrooms was really pretty ugly. And he spent the next half-decade trying unsuccessfully to find ways to tamp down inappropriate test preparation. And what got him off the hook, it was explained to me, was World War II. Because when the war started, the press really didn't care much about the Iowa Brain Derby anymore, and he took advantage of the lack of attention to kill the program entirely. And in 1942, he replaced it with the Iowa Tests of Educational Development with instructions that it should be administered in the fall, so that it would be useful diagnostically and not summatively. So this problem was recognized the better part of a century ago. It was in a prominent publication when I was in diapers 70 years ago. But then let's go ahead to Campbell's Law. I suspect everyone in this room knows Campbell's Law. This is a quote from the seminal paper that Don Campbell wrote in 1975. You'll sometimes see it as 76 because it was reprinted. I'll let you read this. All right. I think everyone knows this. If anyone's interested, email me. I can send you a link to a wonderful monograph that describes instances of this in everything, the fast food industry and policing and healthcare, you name it. But what did Don Campbell use to make this concrete? Score inflation. That's 50 years ago in one of the most cited pieces of social science writing ever produced. Right? This is very, very old news. So let's add a little more to the timeline. By the 1980s, when people started talking about ratcheting up the stakes on testing, there were a number of very prominent people in the field. I've listed three. There are others. George Medaus, Bob Lynn, and Laurie Shepard are the three I've listed, who gave very vehement warnings about what was going to happen if we started attaching stakes to tests. They were largely ignored. I first wrote about it in 1987 and was largely ignored. In 1991, we had the first empirical test of score inflation. It was a cluster randomized trial. It was, by today's standards, a relatively low-stakes environment. I did this with Bob Lynn, Laurie Shepard, and Steve Dunbar. We found, despite what are, by current standards, modest stakes, that 3 years out, the inflation was half an academic year in third-grade mathematics. In 1998, we had the first evaluation of score inflation in a test that did not use the multiple-choice format. That's important because it was common to claim then, and still not entirely rare now, for people to claim that score inflation is a problem of multiple choice tests, which is simply not true. We can get into that in Q&A if you'd like. But this study produced the largest estimate of score inflation in the literature. All right. And in 2003, we have what I call Popham's reversal. Jim Popham was as influential as anyone in the field in urging us to go to high-stakes testing, what he called measurement-driven instruction. And this is what he published in Educational Measurement Issues and Practice in 2003. He referred to assessment-sired sins. This is the first, and that's the second. All right? So my point is, this is old news. All right? I suspect most of you know this literature, so I'll be very brief. I'll just give you one example of each of three things. This is one of my favorite examples of score inflation. My friend and colleague Jen Jennings knows this one very, very well. This is what happened in New York when the state instituted a new high-stakes testing program in 2006. The blue line is the mean on the state tests in grade 8 mathematics. I apologize for the scale on the left, which wasn't very legible even before this machine turned it green. But the increase in scores was about 0.6 of a standard deviation in 3 years. Any of you who spend your time studying trend data know that that number is simply implausible. One does not find uncorrupted changes in test scores up or down anywhere nearly that big in large-scale samples. But the red line is what the state needed. It's the state's performance on the national assessment, which shows an appreciable, but actually very typical for the nation, increase in scores, about 1/6 as much. Joel Klein's response to this graph was, we don't care about what's in the red line, we only care about what's in the blue line. I suggested to reporters that they ask him if he tells parents that. So how does this happen? We have studies going back to, I think, at least 1988 that look at how teachers respond to high-stakes testing. I did not do the early ones. I started a few years later. But there are basically three things that happen. The first is what Lindquist worried about, which is capitalizing on predictable patterns in the tests. My colleagues and I differentiate between reallocation, which is essentially reallocating instructional resources among substantively important things, giving short shrift to things that may be important for the inference but aren't on the test. My favorite example was what a Boston teacher told a student of mine who was working on a survey and interview study. She said, "Why would I teach irregular polygons?" She didn't mean they were unimportant. She meant she hadn't seen any on the Massachusetts test. Coaching refers to focusing on things that are not substantive, on matters of presentation, scoring rubrics, incidental test content, and so on. There is work by Brent Bridgman and others going back, I think, to the early 90s, showing that these factors matter, that if you give items that don't share these irrelevant characteristics, performance drops. All right, gaming refers to before NCLB reclassifying kids so they didn't have to be tested, holding them back in grade, doing things of that sort. My favorite was a district in Texas that would hold kids back in ninth grade if they thought they'd do badly on the critical 10th grade test. And wonder of wonders, find that many of them learned so much they could be promoted to the 11th. And then there's simple cheating, and all of you, I'm sure, know the Atlanta cheating scandal. It's been in the news a lot because of Fannie Willis. That's only the most well-known. What many people don't know is that there are lots of them. And I can give you some citations if you'd like. I don't particularly like this classification because I think one can actually argue that a lot of what's in the first two categories is actually cheating, and I'd be happy to talk about that in Q&A. So I'm just going to give you one example of what I mean by coaching. This is in a book published by the Princeton Review years ago to prepare kids for the 10th grade Massachusetts test that they had to pass to get a diploma. The first half of it was the usual boring, memorize this equation, completely non-intuitive. What one of my students at the time called garbage variety crappy teaching, but not wrong. The second part was literally called popular Pythagorean ratios, and I'll let you read it. So my question is, among whom are these ratios popular? There are popular, and actually 5, 12, 13 doesn't need to be there. It's rarely used because most kids don't know that the square of 13 is 169, so don't use that. What you'll see in test items is 3, 4, 5 and simple multiples of 3, 4, 5. It's there because kids don't know how to calculate square roots. So if you want failure on the item to indicate that a kid doesn't know the Pythagorean theorem, you have to take the arithmetic out of it. So the question is, do you want to hire one of the kids who passed this item to build a roof? Probably not. That's why I say it really is cheating. All right, so I'm going to run over clearly. Apologize. So what challenges does this pose for measurement? Lots. The first is, how do we design tests to lessen the problem of score inflation? And the depressing news, and this may just be my ignorance, but I think not, is I can point to only 2 efforts to address this problem in recent years. I wrote a paper with Anton Begin, who was then at CITO, and Gadi Bar-Levi and Derek Neal, 2 economists at the University of Chicago, wrote another. There has been a little bit of pickup of the Neal approach in development economics, but not because of score inflation, for unrelated reasons. To my knowledge, there has been no pickup of the one that I wrote with Anton. A bunch of students and I labored for a long time to produce one test of the method, which is the least cited paper I have ever written. So I think it's safe to say we haven't really tackled the design problem. The problem of use is self-evident. Obviously, we have to modify how tests are used. I won't dwell on that because I'm taking too much time. The third is probably obvious I know is obvious to some of you here, but probably not at all to others. Almost all large-scale assessments in the United States are linked using one or another form of non-equivalent groups common item methods, so-called need linking. It fails in the case of high-stakes conditions. Whenever there is score inflation, that linking method has failed, and I'll be happy to explain this in Q&A. So what do we do? I presented this question at the Kaufman Lecture at the University of Iowa maybe 12, 15 years ago. And Bob Brennan, who certainly knows as much about linking as any human being alive, responded by saying, that's right, and the problem can't be solved without additional data. That was his simple answer. And the question is, who has tried to do that? I can't point to anyone. All right, then the last is validation. This one is just patently obvious. If there's a risk of score inflation, it is not sufficient to stop validation at the first operational administration of a test. I'm not the only person who said this. Ed Hartle wrote a very clear and persuasive paper on exactly this topic, but I challenge you to go find a report of a large-scale assessment that does this. We simply don't bother. All right, so what can we do? I've already talked longer than I was supposed to. Bear with me, it's the only time I'm going to do this. So, what can we do to make things better? So what are the things that make it hard? Some of them are not our fault. I'm going to draw an analogy to the Volkswagen diesel cheating scandal, emissions cheating scandal. I'd explain it later if you don't know what it was, but about 10 years ago, they were caught cheating on diesel emissions tests. And both the first 2 bullets, I'll use that analogy. We have no effective oversight of our field. This is something that George Madow spent the last, 5 or 6 years of his career worrying about and trying to solve. So why did Volkswagen stop cheating on those tests? Well, it wasn't because a bunch of auto executives got together at a meeting like this and decided, we really shouldn't do this kind of stuff. By the way, they were not the only ones. It was just, it's like Atlanta. It's the one that people know about. They stopped because they got caught. And they got caught by agencies that had the power to punish them severely. The most recent estimate I've read is that they spent $33 billion in penalties to various government agencies around the world. All right? So, second thing, market pressure. Another reason they stopped is because people started saying, I don't trust Volkswagen. Their stock fell 40% in 3 months after this first came out. So they had to do something to rebuild trust. I'll give you a counterexample. Way back when Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas, he went to ETS to buy the National Teacher Exam, the NTE, the predecessor to Praxis, to evaluate practicing teachers. And Greg Anrig, who was then head of ETS, to his credit, said, take a hike. That's not an ethical use of a test. The test is designed to predict behavior that you don't yet have a chance to see. And if you have real behavior there, evaluate people based on their behavior. So what did Bill Clinton's administration do? They looked for another vendor. So market pressure actually, in our case, mitigates against solving these problems. And I can tell you from, frankly, very bitter experience that the people writing those contracts are not, by and large, happy when people like us come and say, you know, we really ought to look at things like score inflation in your state. Usually they say no right off. Sometimes they'll let you spend some money and time and then tell you no. But I don't think that lets us off the hook. I want to go back to what that student wrote me years ago. I think the answer to his second question, is there anything left for us to do, indicates that he got the question really backwards. The fact that these problems have been sitting on our desks, in one case for the better part of a century, indicates how much there is left for us to do. And the fact that we don't have an external enforcement and so on doesn't let us off the hook. We have an obligation to do this. We have an obligation to tackle these problems, partly in choosing the work we do ourselves, but also, frankly, in how we review the work of others, how we evaluate journal articles. This is something I can talk about to the point where you're bored to tears, but how we evaluate funding proposals, how we evaluate junior staff. We need to tell people that, yes, it's valued to tackle these difficult problems. So to wrap up, what am I concretely saying we should do? One is that we need to just select big problems and focus on them, not just in debate within the field, but in choosing our technical work. This is why I said at the beginning that my dichotomy was not really very clean. Some of the ways to respond to these problems of practice are technical. The work that I did with Anton Begin was technical work on developing a new way of designing tests. The second is we have to essentially rekindle our focus on appropriate and inappropriate uses of tests. If we're not going to call people out for using tests inappropriately, who will? But I think we need to broaden out and think about more than just measurement practice. One of the sobering things about reading Lindquist's work for me was his focus on broader goals of education, and it was repeated. He referred over and over again to what we want to see when people leave school. What are we trying to accomplish? And as part of that, given that tests are inextricably intertwined with accountability now, we need to work on better ways to hold schools accountable. Because unless we can institute those, people will simply fall back on what they've been doing for the last, well, in some cases, 30 years, maybe more. Certainly to the early 1990s. I would love to talk more about what this last bullet means. I think there's a lot of room for healthy argument because we will have to do things that frankly haven't been well tested. We're going to get it wrong a lot of the time. But I won't talk about it now because I've already talked, I think, something like 10 minutes longer than I was supposed to. I'll just end by saying that if we really want to honor the legacy of E.F. Lindquist, undertaking this kind of work is the way to do it. We have a logistical awkwardness. There's no second mic. So if there are arguments or questions, I need to repeat them so that people who are watching this can see it. So Scott, where did Scott go? You want me to coordinate this? Okay, that's fine. Yes.
Presentation about score inflation is, I noticed the American Educational Research Association. But to what extent does this exist internationally, other countries? There's a lot of it.
Yes. The short answer, the short but incomplete answer to this is we don't know. I think the answer is almost certainly yes, it does in cases where testing is really high pressure. So if you look at, for example, Singapore, which has a very high stakes test called the primary school leaving exam at the end of grade 6, there is, as there is in countries like, say, South Korea, a huge test prep industry built around that test. It's called tuition, I believe, in Singapore, not test prep. And the government has been struggling literally for 15 years or more to find ways to tamp that down, some of which I think are very interesting. It's actually, I mentioned to someone yesterday, I think the only case in which I have supported the use of standards-based reporting. They stopped reporting scale scores for the primary school leaving exam and present scores only in bands. And the reason is because that forces schools to look at something else. They get all these kids with tied scores. So they have, but I think if we were to do a study there, we would find score inflation. Early on, when this research was new, a small group of us decided we were going to try to take advantage of European integration to test exactly this with matriculation exams, because matriculation exams were now going to be a key to studying in other countries. And so it's logical to ask, to what extent do kids who score well on the back score well on the Baden-Württemberg Abitur? So someone a European member of this group said, let me do the asking. I have contacts in many of the ministries. And the next time we met, he said, the short answer is, please don't ask the question. So I think, if you look at what causes score inflation, it's almost inconceivable that it wouldn't be true in other places because people are doing exactly the same things. If you go back to the non-quantitative studies of this, like there's a book written by George Medaus and Tom Callahan, probably does anyone know, 1960s maybe? They found, going through files for the Irish leaving exam, which was the equivalent of the O-level, literally identical essays in the files. People had passed them on to their siblings and whatnot. So I think the short answer is it's probably there, but we don't know. Yeah.
I was just reading the email exchange we had 18 years ago. Your answer to my question of whether there's anything left to do was, I hope so. I have a few years left in my career.
I still hope so, and I have no years left in my career. You should identify yourself.
I'm Dr. Alexander Hoffman. I studied with Dan Koretz 18 years ago.
And he wrote those two bullets.
So think about the Arkansas example. If states won't take no for an answer, and there's always a vendor who will take their money, what does all this work matter?
Well, I think it's indirect. So let me go back to that graph of New York. One of the reasons I'm fond of that graph is because that graph represents data that produced, I believe, 7 qualifying and dissertation papers. And the way, basically, I got every item response from the state of New York for something like 7 years of data. How did I get it? Because of the press. Every single year that the New York State released its results, the press called me and Howard Everson and a few other people trying to get stories of malfeasance. And if we couldn't give them that, at least get stories about score inflation every year. And the state finally decided that just as a political matter, they had really better deal with it because they couldn't escape it. So I think part of it is another task that our field doesn't honor as much as it should, which is communication to the public. Once the word gets out, it becomes harder and harder to hide from this. But I think it's indirect. Yeah, Andrew.
Two questions at once, I think, but my question is going to, because there are a lot of them. But my question is going to be, can you talk about the larger goals of education? Are they easy to measure or hard to measure? Are they subject to inflation, more subject to inflation, or less subject?
Actually, Scott's going to tell me to repeat this. Yes. So Andrew is asking me to talk about the broader goals and whether those are also coachable or whatever. So let's separate the goals.
You should take more than one question.
No, I'll do this one because I'll forget to repeat yours. Let's separate the goals from other measures, all right? Because what's clearly gameable in many cases is the other measures. And so, actually, let me advance. I think I brought a supplementary slide. All right. So I wrote a book, I don't know how many years, some years ago, in which I tried to address the question of what we could do differently. And I think there are two parts of this. One is there are principles that I think are reasonably safe, The specifics of how one might implement those, I think, are really arguable because we have so little data. But I think the first is, and then I'm going to answer your question once I go through this list, measuring what really matters. And part of that is, I think, unavoidably looking at what happens in schools. It means, unfortunately, I think, accepting the need for human judgment. I don't think we can adequately evaluate schools based solely on numbers. I just don't think it can be done. There are lots of reasons, and economists have reasons that we don't think about, why using subjective evaluation in a civil service system is a bad idea, but I don't know that we can avoid it. I think we have to pay attention to context, the notion that two identical scores from two different schools mean the same thing, which is the basis of has been the basis of our accountability system for years, is absolute nonsense. The create counterbalancing incentives, it takes a little explanation. There's a wonderful paper, and I don't have the citation off the top of my head, but I'll be glad to get it for anyone who is interested, by two British economists written during the years of Tony Blair's reforms, which were basically like test-based accountability for the whole system, in which they argued that the system was like the Soviet economic system, where every single person in the plant had the same incentive. And nobody had any incentive to see how people were meeting those goals. And what that resulted in was the kind of stuff that sounds apocryphal but really wasn't, like factories that produced only small shoes because you get more of them out of a given amount of leather. That's what we're doing. There is nobody in our system who has an incentive to go in and say, Andrew, you raised scores a lot. I want to see how you did it. If scores went up, you're done. When New York City brought in their pseudo inspectorate system, they brought test prep with them. They didn't look to see how scores are being raised. And the last is that we're going to get it wrong a lot of the time, and we have to evaluate all the time. So the question is, buried in here, are there measures that are gameable? Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you look at say, healthcare, which is the area where I think the most research has been done on Campbell's Law, it's just unavoidable. What Jim Heckman years ago said the solution is what he called dynamic accountability. You see the hose bulge over here, you step on it, and then it bulges over here, and you step on it over there. But people are always going to be looking for shortcuts, some people. So I don't think there is one stable way to hold schools accountable. But actually, I'm going to indulge myself with an anecdote about this. One of Andrew's and mine, colleagues had some kind of connection. And when Arnie Duncan became Secretary of Education, she arranged a bunch of meetings between academics and him. And I was asked to come to the one on accountability. And I asked him at one point, what reminded me of this is the question about the other important things. One of his staff members said with evident irritation, what the hell do you mean by when you keep saying all the other important stuff? Which I hadn't realized I had said. But so, and I tried to explain to him, and I'll tell you what I gave him. But I then asked him, can you tell me whether the accountability system you're proposing will encourage what I'm going to describe? And they couldn't. And I said, can you at least tell me it won't discourage it? They couldn't. And what I referred to, and I'll give you the brief version of this, is a fourth grade mathematics teacher, or a fourth grade teacher I watched teaching mathematics. I was once a fourth grade teacher, so I did this actually for my kids, but I knew what I was looking for. Who's the best fourth grade math teacher I had ever seen, who had every day a problem in which kids could, to some degree, work in groups, but their work was scored. They had to write journals that were scored not on the basis of having correct answers, but on the basis of having logical reasoning and completeness. The day I was there, the problem was, which is stronger, a rectangle or a triangle? And the whole class, there's a big hubbub, and hand went up. What do you mean by stronger? She said, great question. And the answer is, which would hold more weight if you piled weights on top of them? And they all got it. Most of them got it wrong. So she passed out little triangles and rectangles were held by pins in the corner, and huge bedlam, right? Who was wrong? It's waving. I was wrong. I was wrong. I was in awe. And she ended this class by asking if any kids, these are fourth graders, would like to try to explain their mistake. Right? Unbelievably good math instruction. How are you going to know that that's there? And the short answer is you have to go look. And that involves the inevitable problems with subjective judgment, with all of the problems we all know about with subjective judgment. Would it be gameable if we gave people a list and said, here are the things we're going to look for when we come to watch your class? Yes. But the higher inference, and therefore much riskier evaluation, is harder to gain, I think. But again, that's not empirically tested. So that's why I said a lot of this is arguable. Yes. Yes. Hi, Jill. Nice to meet you finally face to face.
And other education economists keep producing studies to show that test-based accountability for teachers works. That is, if we fire the teachers that have the smallest test score gains, replace them with better teachers, subsequently student scores go up. And regardless of the test score inflation, and regardless that we're not really measuring ideally what we want to measure, isn't it better for Dallas and Washington, D.C. that the students have higher test scores? And so my question to you is, what is the rebuttal to that argument?
Well, there's several. First, a system like that only works if you have a bunch of very good teachers waiting to be hired. Right? We don't. Second, we know, if you look at the literature on value-added, or at least I think my interpretation is that we know, if you look at the literature on value-added modeling, that we often get it wrong. That our evaluations of which teachers are good are sometimes right. There are some teachers who produce very small gains who are in fact lousy teachers, and the kids would be benefited by having them removed, assuming you could get a good replacement. But there are other very good teachers who sometimes have very low gain scores. And that's been quantified, actually. We know how bad that problem is. The other rebuttal I would have is that, well, two. One is, if you go back to what Lindquist said over and over again, and what his followers, the people who followed him in the IRA program kept telling administrators literally for decades, is that what we can successfully measure with test scores is a fairly small portion of what you need to be worrying about. Right? For years, the Iowa people, I don't know whether Lindquist wrote this phrase, but they told administrators and teachers that what you can measure with our tests, meaning their tests, was, quote, specialized supplementary information. All right? And one of the failures, in my view, of Rick's notion of this, and he and I have been arguing this in person for, 40 years, is that he treats that score as if it's error-free and complete, and it's neither. So do I agree with him that, yes, getting rid of some bad teachers would help? Yes, if we could replace them. And will test scores in some cases identify them? Yes, but it's going to get it wrong a lot of the time. And in the meantime, it's very clear to me, I mean, there are people who disagree with me, including at least one of my colleagues, but I think it's pretty clear from the American data that what we've been doing for the last 30 years has failed. You know, there was a huge increase in elementary school math scores. That's the one success people can point to. What they don't tell you, the advocates, is that we have 3 national tests we can look at. The other 2 show about 40% or 45% as big a gain. The second thing they don't tell you is that the interpretation of the research by a National Research Council panel that evaluated this is that only a fraction of that gain is attributable to accountability. And the third thing that nobody knows is we have known since the late 1980s that one of the ways teachers respond to high-stakes testing in mathematics is by not teaching anything else. I'm exaggerating, but by taking time from other things. And because I had a lot of former teachers among my students, I heard stories about this every year. Schools where music class, labeled music, was in fact mathematics test prep. So we don't know how much of that gain in mathematics, which by the way has stopped, was actually not an increase in achievement, but simply funneling achievement out of one topic and into another. If you look at the gap between high achieving and low achieving kids, it's gotten worse, even though the fundamental argument in favor of test-based accountability in the United States was equity. If you go back to No Child Left Behind and ask, why did Teddy Kennedy and George Miller in the House support George Bush's signature education initiative? It's because of equity. George Miller said, we need to shine light in the corners. We need to identify districts that have high scores but aren't doing anything for poor kids. All right? So did it work? No, it failed. So I think that failure speaks for itself. Derek.
Thanks for the comment. And the question, of course, I feel like to some extent, you've given a talk about what describe as glass half full talk. And actually, I wonder if you have a glass half empty.
I was going to say empty, not full, Derek.
Do you see any reasons for optimism going forward in terms of like you've sort of spoken about the last 20 years, what hasn't happened the last 20 years that you wish had happened? Do you see when you look at when you were scoping through Jen and MIT, do you see any reasons for optimism in some of the things you see? Is there any reasons maybe you think that, there could be some better things to rise? Just giving you a chance to recast.
Yeah, right. So for those people who couldn't hear Derek, he's asked me, he said that I gave the glass half empty talk, and what about the glass half full? Are there any grounds for optimism? Yeah, I think so, but in my view, they are outweighed by the negative. I mean, I'm pleased by the fact that there is growing focus on how things are done elsewhere. The amount of knowledge in the field about assessment programs outside the United States is vastly better than it was before. I think there is much more use of, and in many cases, better use of trustworthy data like the national assessment. I'd say this guardedly, excited by some of the efforts to expand the boundaries of how we do assessment. And I'm saying that guardedly because I don't think that the difficulties in doing this are always fully acknowledged, but I think the potential for real improvements, in part through technology, are really exciting. But I think if we use those tests the way we use these tests, we're back where we started. Yeah, please.
I teach at a biology at a school district where we give common assessments, and we recently, after the teachers complained multiple years in a row, replaced one of those assessments with a project, an project. And can you talk about the work or research on that type of assessment?
Well, okay, the question is, what about the research on using larger projects rather than conventional tests? I got to check my watch before I answer that question. I'm really glad you answered it because that question has been on and off again a focus of the research literature since the late 1980s. It's a little demoralizing that we actually repeat the same thing over and over again, but the answer, I think, really rests with what you're trying to do. Right? So this goes back to the Iowa people talking about specialized supplementary information. Big projects are really lousy for certain purposes. They're very poor for providing comparable data across school districts, for example. But they're very good for determining a lot of other things. So some years ago, I was on a panel hosted by a whole bunch of Massachusetts districts about the Massachusetts MCAS test. And a very high-achieving high school senior who had, I was told by somebody in the panel, had been given 3 Ivy League offers for college the next year, got up and said that the most valuable work he had done in high school was some science experiments, not the demonstrations that are called experiments, real experiments, right? And he said, how can MCAS, the Massachusetts test, be adapted to include that sort of thing? And the other panelists all struggled to find some way to do it. And I said, you're asking the wrong question. That's exactly what tests are not designed to do. That's what your teacher is supposed to do. That's the other information that Lindquist people were talking about. So when Vermont was first starting its portfolio assessment program, I was their external evaluator. I remember while it was still being designed, driving in a van across the state doesn't take very long. Driving across the state was a short conversation about it with one person designing the program. And I said, if you had to choose between an assessment program that fosters, maybe through modeling, better instruction and one that gives you better comparable data, which would you choose? And he said, I want both. And I said, you didn't answer my question. If you had to choose one, which would you choose? And he said, well, which would you choose? And I said, my kids? He said, yeah, your kids. I said, better instruction. No doubt. All right? So I think you're asking for something that schools ought to be emphasizing, but it's going to serve different purposes. Other questions? What is our timing? How long do we have? We're out of time? All right. Well, thank you all.